We talk a lot about video games that I've experienced, but what if we took a second to stand back and look at gaming history from a different perspective, by looking at the first 30 Super Nintendo games ever released? I'm excited to talk about this, and while I'm sure that many of you have heard of every single game that's going to be mentioned here today, maybe there's a few you haven't heard of. Let's begin. A lot of people think that Super Mario Kart was the first racing game on the Super Nintendo, but no, it wasn't. In fact, Super Mario Kart wasn't released until a little bit later. It's still within the release window for the Super Nintendo, but it was still a year after this, right? FZero was important because, much like quite a few of the games on this list, they utilized a specific function of the Super Nintendo known as Mode 7, and it was also a pack-in for the Super Nintendo competition set. I've dabbled with the idea of a short and sweet video talking about launch bundles for specific consoles, and if this would interest you, let me know down below. I'd love to make it. Now in FZero, the difficulty is directly tied to speed, and for all intents and purposes, it set the groundwork for what we would expect from racing games moving forward. They didn't need to always be fast like FZero, but there were expectations for visuals, controls, and more. This is obviously the first game in the FZero franchise, a legacy franchise that I feel Nintendo has sort of left to stagnate. And no, I don't think that shitting out some 99 iteration is an attempt to keep it alive, right? I think it's fan service, but that's just my personal opinion. In the game, we can choose 4 different characters. Our whole job is just to make it to the end of the race alive, which is easier said than done. It's a fun game though. Konami's first game on the Super Nintendo was Gradius 3, the third proper game from the Gradius franchise. Now, Gradius 3 was released in the arcades, but it wasn't released in the arcades in America. The only way that we could enjoy it was if we had a Super Nintendo, and if we didn't have a Super Nintendo, we would have to wait 10 years for Gradius 3 and 4 on the PlayStation 2. So if you were a loyalist to the franchise, this was the game to have. As with all Gradius games, it's what we expect, right? A challenging horizontal shooter where we control the famous Vic Viper going to the right and shooting the shit out of everything that shows up. One of the cooler things about the Super Nintendo entry though is that we could actually continue if we lost all of our lives, which wasn't the case with Gradius 3 in the arcades. If you lost, you lost. You know, it's funny to talk about Konami in the arcades. They were notorious for bleeding you dry of coins in the 80s and 90s, and if you ask me, I wouldn't waste my money on a game that didn't afford me the opportunity to learn it. The most recent game from the Gradius universe that's mattered is Gradius Rebirth, and it was a WiiWare game, so There were newer ones, but I don't consider Patchy Slot video games in the slightest, and Gradius Arc, it was a phone game. Konami just doesn't seem to care about their legacy IPs anymore, and that's a shame. For a long time, flight simulators were hit and miss, and that's the unfortunate truth about the design of a game. You're gonna have moments when it doesn't perform to the standards that you would expect, whatever those standards were at the time. To me, Pilot Wings is a silly, overrated game, but as a launch title, I do see the novelty and fun in playing it. We go through various challenges, earning various licenses and various flight vehicles, be it a light plane, be it our bodies as a skydiver, be it a rocket belt. Exciting. I believe the reason why this game looked so good was because Naoki Mori worked with Shuhei Kato, Hajime Yajima, and Takumi Kawagoe to really make that Mode 7 pop, and they did, and it looks good for what it is. This pseudo-franchise did have a little bit of an exciting return with Pilot Wings Resort in 2011 for the 3DS, but I don't think we're going to see anything else from Nintendo on this one. SimCity has an interesting history. For starters, the inspiration for the whole city planning medium was odd. Will Wright, the creator of SimCity, had a mildly successful game known as Raid on Bungling Bay. It was a Commodore 64 game that was put on the Nintendo Versus system, but only in Japan, and then finally released on the NES in 1987. In the game, we play as a helicopter going around blowing up factories and returning to an aircraft carrier if we need to reload. It's actually quite fun. Think of Desert Strike without all of the mission requirements, right? Now, why do I mention Raid on Bungling Bay? What's the point here? What am I trying to segue into? Well, the creator, Will Wright, he felt like he had more fun working on a level editor where he could place buildings where he wanted to, and he thought to himself, I can make a game out of this. Will Wright took the time to study up on urban development, and from that, SimCity was born, a game where we can strive to hit the elusive 1 million population while dealing with traffic, fires, earthquakes, pollution, tons of different things. I absolutely adore this game, and I've always had a blast with the SimCity line of games, and even though this one is fairly rudimentary, I had a good time with it, and I think you would as well. It's always fun to see where these legacy franchises began, and I gain more respect for it by playing them in their order of release. Now, the most recent game is SimCity Build It, but again, it's a mobile game, and it hurts me to see some of the most famous legacy franchises be relegated to the mobile market. It's a shame. It truly is. Well, it doesn't get much more Super Nintendo than this. Super Mario World was the game on the Super Nintendo. It was a launch title, but was also bundled in with the SNES Superset. In some cases, it was included as a bonus in the Super NES control set, if you were lucky. It's one of the greatest games ever released, and it's one of Nintendo's highest grossing games historically, selling 20 million copies over its lifespan. Everything we knew and loved from the earlier Mario games, they moved over, and Mario just felt real, and thanks to the amazing artwork from Katsuya Eguchi and Hideki Kono, those visuals are burned into our minds forever as little core memories, and I guarantee you, if you let your kids play this, they'll have the same joy that you felt so many years ago. Never miss the opportunity to see your kids smile. With tons of power-ups, far more than I've noticed in previous Mario entries to date, to me this was not only an accessible game, it was also a fun one that people of all ages and skill levels could enjoy. It's a must-play on the Super Nintendo. The most recent Super Mario Bros. Game is Super Mario Bros. Wonder, and I think it's a great game, gimmicky, but all Mario games are. Well, I actually recently played this one for another episode. I think it's one of the shortest games on the Super Nintendo, and that's ultimately up to your skill level. Now, I will say the Chessmaster series has been around since 1986. There was another game that came out after the initial one known as the Fidelity Chessmaster 2100, right? The Chessmaster that we know and love on the NES and Super Nintendo was the 1989 system that was ported to not only the NES and Super Nintendo, but also to the Game Gear and the Game Boy. And it's a good, solid game. The one thing I've noticed, though, is that the computer can be really slow in how they react to your moves. But I guess that's just programming 101. But if you ask me, Battle Chess is a little bit faster. It's still a wonderful system that has stood the test of time, and in my opinion, it's the definitive chess experience on any platform that it's represented on. The most recent Chessmaster is Chessmaster Live on the Xbox Live Arcade in 2008, but Ubisoft owns the IP, and I doubt we will ever see another game in this franchise again. And that's a shitty thing. Draken is an older RPG. When we think of 3D RPGs, this is one of the pioneers of it. It also has RTS elements as well, so from a historical perspective, this game is incredibly important if you care about the history of early RPGs, which is something I covered fairly early in my YouTube career with a Ready Go Gaming Show entry all about the history of RPGs. It's kind of a horrible episode, chalk it up to me not knowing how to edit, but we all start somewhere, and I don't hide my mistakes. I learn from them. Draken is a mean game though. It's not easy, you can walk around from the get-go, but you need to build experience much like any RPG at the time. And if you've played the PC version of Draken, you might notice that the Super Nintendo version, it's slightly different. In fact, the story is much different, and it's due to translation issues. The original version of Draken was created by Infogrames, a French company, and the Japanese localization on the Super Nintendo was from Kimco Seika, a Japanese company, so that's a nightmare and a half waiting to happen. And then they translate it from Japanese to English, the result of which is a different story. Basically, the Draconians are dealing with some USDA Prime bullshit, and the Dragon Gods, they don't like them very much. In fact, they're gonna Thanos them. Hasta la bye-bye them, if you will. Now, the plot dictates if 4 warriors could possibly discover the 8 tiers or artifacts, the Draconians would be spared, and the gods themselves would fall. It's a very rudimentary game, but I still believe it's worth checking out. Oh hey, it's time for HAL Labs. Hyperzone is their first game on the Super Nintendo, and it's a doozy. You know, I've never messed with this, but think of Hyperzone as a Star Fox before Star Fox was cool, right? It's a rail shooter, and I feel it was designed to make Mode 7 pop. No more, no less. It's also rather short. It only has 8 levels, and I almost added it to the shortest Super Nintendo episode because of it. Now, if you were a kid who enjoyed playing games on the Amiga home computer or any of the other 8-bit computers at the time, you might recall a game called Eliminator. It plays a lot like it. Like, a lot. Like, HAL peeked over your shoulder during the final exam a lot. There's also some nifty references to other games and Nintendo stuff, but I'll let you discover that on your own. Where Konami had Gradius, Irem had RType, and in many ways it was a reflection of a small competition between the two companies. They both had badass ideas, and those ideas tended to align with the interests of consumers who enjoyed horizontal shooters. I'm not one of them, but RType is fairly decent for what it is. Now the problem is, when it came time to port RType 2 to the Super Nintendo, they made a mistake. And that was that the developers could not figure out how to make multiple sprites work on the Super Nintendo. So instead of a proper port of RType 2, we have Super RType, a dumbed down version of RType 2 that basically just ripped 4 stages out of it and added 3 new stages. All the while slowing down to a snail's pace, at least from what we would expect from the game. Despite this, people still love Super RType, and even though the sprite work affects the gameplay, those sprites look damn good. Props to Irem. RType still thrives to this day, albeit Irem lets Granzella handle the heavy lifting, with their most recent game being RType Final 3 Evolved. For years, Capcom primarily gave love to their 1904X series. From the arcades to the NES, we had 2 home ports of arcade entries, and if you're me, you like them. You might not, and if you don't, that's fine, but I find them to be somewhat approachable, and I appreciate that. The same love and energy I had for the NES ports of the 1904X series, I had for the Super Nintendo port of UN Squadron. It's one of my favorite Capcom horizontal shooters. Eons better than Section Z or Hyperdyne Sidearms if you ask me. UN Squadron is actually based on a Japanese manga named Area 88, which is what the Japanese port is called, but UN Squadron, solid game. In the game we could choose from 3 different pilots, Shin Kazama, Mickey Simon, or Greg Gates. And therein lies the problem. One of the things I don't like about the home port conversion of UN Squadron is that in the arcade version, these pilots had their own unique aircraft. Shin flew a F-20 Tiger, Mickey flew an F-14 Tomcat, and Greg flew an A-10 Thunderbolt too, but in the Super Nintendo version, unfortunately, no matter who you choose, you will always start in an F-8 Crusader. But as you earn money, you can upgrade your airplane and your weapons. It's actually pretty neat for what it is, but I just like the arcade game better. You might be asking, who is Hal? Why is he important? I didn't vote for him. Well, in Hal's Hole-in-One Golf, Hal isn't a person, but the company. It's a standard golf game as far as I'm concerned. The one thing that made it stand out is that it uses mode 7 to accurately represent elevation, which I found to be a nice touch. I do find it funny though. I guess the Japanese didn't know enough popular American golfers to seek an endorsement, but they sure as hell knew who they wanted for the Super Famicom version. It was known as Jumbo Ozaki no Hole-in-One. Apparently Jumbo was hot shit or something, I don't know. The game is cute though. Oh boy, Populace. Okay, here we go. Full disclosure. This game is a boring, nonsensical ass bandit of a time. I have tried for years to get into Populace, but I could not for the life of me bear any patience for Peter Molyneux's slow-ass isometrics butthole of a game that I find Populace to be. Now that being said, this was designed by Bulldog Productions originally, at least on all the computers that it was popular on, but when it came time to port it, Infinity ported it. And for those of you who absolutely hated Ultima 4 and 5 on the NES, you can thank Infinity for it. They were a company that would port any popular computer game that was just plopped into their lap into a subpar time on a home console medium. You just had to slide them a $10 bill or a six-pack, they'd do it, and I've yet to find a game of theirs that I enjoy. Populace is one of the earliest examples of a god game, if that makes sense. People loved it. I cannot figure out for the life of me why, but our whole job is to be a god and lead people into the right direction by doing god things, which to me involved pausing the game and throwing it into the fucking swamp behind my house. Or if we want to be a generous god, we can terraform the landscape, grow civilization, bomb the shit out of the enemy with divine interventions, anything you want. It's not for me, but it might be for you. For those of you who played games on the NES growing up, you might recognize the Bases Loaded series from Jaleco because they created 4 games on the NES. 2 and 3, in my opinion, are badass baseball games because it allowed you to manually aim your bat over specific quadrants to fine-tune your aim, and I like that. Even the fielding wasn't as bad as other baseball games on the NES, but now we're in the era of Super Nintendo, and I mean, I personally haven't played it, but people were kind of on the fence about it. It's very much a 16-bit experiment in making a proper baseball game, and I give props to Jaleco for being the first company to do it on this new console, at least in the US region. You know, a lot of people say that if you watch anime, you're a weeb or you're a loser, but I say to those same people, fuck you. Like 50% of the shit that you likely watched growing up was influenced by Japanese shows. Power Rangers, Big Bad Beetleborgs, Speed Racer, Robotech, Kamen Rider, Voltron, VR Troopers, Iron Chef America? Yeah, guess what else was? Ultram Man. Now, Ultram Man had been around for a while. It started in the mid-60s, but by the time it got to America, at least properly, it was 1992. Like, I barely remember seeing the show Ultram Man Towards the Future, but that show spawned this game from a company that isn't really well known, Nova, and they tended to not be well known. They were a contractor-based development company, right? Mostly in cahoots with Bandai, Tomy, and Takara, all of which were toy makers. So there's the writing on the wall for you. They made video games to parallel a toy market. The game itself, it's a fighting game, and we go through a few levels kicking the dog shit out of kaiju enemies from the Ultram Man franchise. It's also stupid hard. Like, I remember playing this for a few minutes and just sitting there wondering what happened. It's very different from fighting games at the time. Actrazer to me is one of the best Super Nintendo games ever released, hands down. It stands tall and proud alongside the other giants such as Final Fantasy III, Chrono Trigger, Soul Blazer, right? Which ironically was made by the same company that did Actrazer, Quintet. Actrazer is a game, it caught me off guard. The meat and bones of the game involve rebuilding the villages that Tanzer and his goons destroyed. So not only do we have therapeutic city building simulations, we also have badass action platforming sequences that make sense. You hear that? Earthworm Jim 2, you dip spit flavored Sprite! I hate Earthworm Jim 2. We play as the Master, and the Master is not someone to be fucked with. He's a walking god, and in my opinion, is incredibly fun to play as. The sword strikes feel real, the magic isn't overly gimmicky, and it works fine, and the boss fights actually take technical ability, but they can be cheesed. Now, I will comfortably pretend that Actrazer 1 is the only Actrazer game. If you see a game called Actrazer 2, call the CDC, because the entire cartridge needs to be launched into the deepest recesses of the known universe in a containment bag. Hopefully whatever alien species finds it thinks that we're so fucking dumb that they'll leave us alone. Oh, by the way, did you know that they remade Actrazer? It's called Actrazer Renaissance, and it's a dumpster fire. They decided to shoehorn tower defense into it. Yeah, enjoy that. John Madden Football, EA's take on a wonderful sport that's been abused and reused from 1988 all the way to now, and honestly, I don't mind it. It's been the premier football simulator, and nothing else has really come close to it, at least from my experience. Now, the Super Nintendo release is kind of weird. It's based off of the original PC game, but the Genesis, right, Sega Genesis, had 2 John Madden football games already, so they just yanked the stuff from John Madden 92 and threw it on the Super Nintendo port. It's not a bad game at all, though. Paperboy came from an era where anything and everything could be made into an arcade game, and who better to come up with wild ideas than Atari? In Paperboy, at least the original game, we could ride our bicycle, delivering papers to the people who like us, and destroying the shit out of people's personal property if they don't like us. And of course, because we're riding a bike, we have to dodge stuff occasionally. Paperboy 2 was the follow-up, and honestly, on a fundamental level, it's really not that different, right? It's still Paperboy, just with a graphical update. We still have that weird, strange difficulty, but the one thing that I did like about it is that if we do anything during our stages, they tend to end up in the paper the next day. RPM Racing, or Radical Psycho Machine Racing, is a game from a company you know, but probably didn't realize you did know. Silicon and Synapse. Silicon and Synapse made some novelty games here and there, such as Rock and Roll Racing, which is the spiritual successor to this, and The Lost Vikings, a cult classic that received numerous ports throughout its run. Silicon and Synapse would eventually change their name to Chaos Studios, but that name didn't stick. How about Blizzard Entertainment? Yep, this is one of the first games Blizzard ever released, right before Warcraft, Orcs, and Humans, and from that point on, it's been a home name in your houses, on our computers, and in the courtroom, because apparently Blizzard employees can't keep their fucking hands to themselves. All that aside though, RPM Racing is a fun little time waster. You can do a single race, run a career, edit your own courses. It's pretty neat. Plus, if you're a more seasoned gamer in my audience, you might recognize the game this is based on, Racing Destruction Set on the Commodore 64. Sports games are the perfect thing to shove onto a console, especially within its release window, because at the time, buying a video game console was something that was done as a family choice. At least that's how my dad described it to me. To justify bringing in something that maintained tons of software, it needed to be something that everyone could enjoy. And for every kid-style game, we had sports games that were aimed to the adult demographic, and that's where True Golf Classics comes into play. It was a badass game on the Super Nintendo, but I didn't really hear about it until I was going through some 3DO games. Part of the marketing gimmick for the Super Nintendo was placing Super in front of games that existed in the previous generation, like Super Turrican or Super Donkey Kong, which was the Super Famicom naming convention for Donkey Kong Country. Now you know. And this is a trend, right? The same thing would be done on the Nintendo 64 with the suffix of 64 following a majority of the games that were released earlier in the console's life. Super Tennis is a facelifted tennis on the NES, and it doesn't control too bad. Even the Mode 7 helps with the perspective of the gameplay, which I find to be an excellent way of easing people into it. Capcom had some wonky games out there, but in the 90s they found a sweet spot with games that involved punching people in the face. They had a fighting game, it was called Street Fighter or Fighting Street, but guess what? It sucked dick. It was an incredibly bad game that honestly I'm shocked ever received a sequel. But it did, in 1991. But before that, Capcom had other plans, a beat-em-up game in the Street Fighter franchise known as Street Fighter 89. They wanted to create one because Data East had released Double Dragon and that was making waves in the arcade. But the name didn't stick. Instead, they created their own franchise, Final Fight. Now, for all intents and purposes, Final Fight is still regarded as being in the Street Fighter universe. We see Guy, Cody, and Hager quite often. Even Cody was in Street Fighter V Arcade Edition. I actually enjoy Final Fight, a little bit more in the arcades, but for what it is, it's a damn good time. I feel dirty calling this Final Fantasy II because I do subscribe to the school of thought where this is the fourth Final Fantasy game. For anybody who doesn't know, Square worked really quickly to create entries in the Final Fantasy franchise for the Famicom, and by the time we were ready for the next Final Fantasy game in America, Final Fantasy IV had already been released, so instead of calling it Final Fantasy IV, they called it Final Fantasy II in America. This is the same numbering convention that went for Final Fantasy VI on the Super Famicom and Final Fantasy III on the Super Nintendo. Now, the one thing I enjoy about Final Fantasy games is that there is always some mechanic change that kept the franchise fresh, and in the case of Final Fantasy II, we have the active time battle system. That's something that stuck around as well. This is a great game, but for me, it was kind of overshadowed by Final Fantasy III 3 years later. Another one of those super games, Super Ghouls and Ghosts, is the third entry in the Ghosts and Goblins franchise, and it plays just as slowly as the NES version. Yikes. I'm kind of biased though, I do much prefer Ghouls and Ghosts on the Genesis, but it's nice to see Arthur returning to the things that he does so well, like piss off the underworld because he couldn't keep his dick in his pants. Now when I think of this game, I think of a modified and improved Ghosts and Goblins. The landscapes are nice, the environmental effects are wonderful, the controls are... The gameplay is... I don't like this game at all. I know it's a rite of passage to many on the Super Nintendo, but every version I've played of it, it runs really badly. Like Super Famicom, Super Nintendo, either one, it's not good. Maybe take the time to check it out for yourself. It's gonna kick your butt though. Darius as a franchise broke my heart. When I was a young lad, I went to the Galloping Ghost with a good friend and fellow streamer and YouTuber, Tesseract. We were excited to check out all of these games, and with me being such a huge fan of shooters, we started with Darius. Now Darius is one of those games that lets you go all the way to the end of it, thinking that you can use credits. Then if you die on the last stage, fuck you. I have never recovered from that betrayal, ever. That being said, Darius Twin is the third game of the franchise, and it's a nifty little horizontal shooter. I do enjoy Darius games, but they can be mean in the arcades. This one though, it's kind of different from the arcades, specifically in how we use our power-ups. It's worth checking out if you want to see what Taito was up to in the early Super Nintendo years. Have you ever played Speedball? It's a top-down, futuristic handball game that's a novelty because it was different. Personally, I've played it on the Amiga, right? I played it through Anstream Arcade, and it supports Amiga, and I thought it was nifty. Then my good friend and fellow YouTuber, Old Man Sim, popped into my Twitch channel, and he mentioned this, so I had to play it, at least for a little bit. It's basically Speedball, but with basketball, and unfortunately, I don't think that top-down basketball was ever a concept that should have existed. This game was created by the Evil 3, but it was ported by Hudson Soft. And it's got a crazy plot too. You know Bill Laimbeer? Well, this game takes place in 2031, and he's the commissioner of the league. And with him playing for those dirty Detroit Pistons, he's fired all of the refs, yanked all of the rules, and now allows bombs. While Bill never made it to the commissioner role, he did do a great job as a coach after his playing years were done. He actually just retired a few years ago. He was the coach of the Las Vegas Aces when I was stationed there. Pretty cool guy. This one is a unique one. It's an action-adventure game, and while I've never played it, I do know of it. It's a Kimco game, and it plays like Ys or Soul Blazer. It's a top-down action-adventure game that had a release on the Sharp X68000 home computer, and obviously the Super Nintendo. The whole story involves Nazir, the champion of light, trying to figure out why the lagoon's water supply is corrupted. It's a decent game, at least from what I understand about it. It does the job, and that's all that matters. If you do want more bang for your buck though, try the computer version. It has animated cutscenes, where the Super Nintendo version obviously couldn't handle it. Now I will say Kimco games, they haven't been the best to me, at least from my experience. A majority of their work was present on the NES, Super Nintendo, and Game Boy, and to me it's always been forgettable, but I'll let you be the judge. Did you ever play Baseball Simulator 1 on the NES? Right? This is its big brother. It was also made by Culture Brain. I actually recently covered them for the first time on the channel when I was talking about the magic of Scheherazade and Flying Dragon: The Secret Scroll. Baseball Simulator was their little mini-series. In total, it had 7 games, the last being released in 1997 called Pro Yaku Star. Now in Super Baseball Simulator 1, we can play traditional baseball with the Atlantic and Northern Leagues, but if we want to be spicy, we can play in the Ultra League, where people like Barry Bonds thrive. They can use power-ups or steroids, but hey, I think that would be a really cool league. Just people juiced out to the max sending baseballs to outer space. I think I'd pay money to watch that. I love Castlevania. I always have and I always will. And in my opinion, this is one of the best games on the Super Nintendo. And it came out really early in the Super Nintendo's lifespan. So right from the get-go, if I wanted to own a Super Nintendo growing up, this would have been one of the games that I would have wanted to own. Super Castlevania keeps all of the mechanics and tropes that made this series fun to date, but it gives Simon the ability to whip in any direction. And because we can make our whip go limp, we can block projectiles instead of having to dodge it. This is a must play on the platform, hands down. In particular, I like the usage of a password system. I just feel like we can control a very fluid Simon in comparison to what we could do on the NES. Super Off-Road is an older game. It was originally an arcade game created by Graft Gold in 1989, and if you want to play it, it's called Ivan Stewart Super Off-Road, but the name was dropped in the Super Nintendo game due to licensing issues. Now, I can't find any information on why it would have been dropped, but something tells me that it involved a guy named Benjamin Franklin and some paper that may or may not be used to buy things. To be fair though, it was released on anything that was capable of running it. Over 13 ports were made, but the Super Nintendo version, it's special to me. Why? 2 words. Tim Fallon. Tim is inevitable. You cannot stop him. Yeah, Tim did the music on this because the SNES port was developed by Software Creations, and historically I've noticed that Software Creation games are poo, right? They're just shit. They're just horrible fucking games. But then Tim comes in wearing a parachute, comes in through the ceiling, and saves the day with amazing music. Now, the one thing that sucks is that on the NES version, you could play with 4 players. You would have to use a satellite or the Force score, but it was possible. It's not possible on the Super Nintendo. It only supports 2 players. Well, here we are, the 30th game, and it's a poop one. Home Alone. Now, if you played Home Alone on the NES, you know that it's dreadful, right? You basically run away from the wet bandits for like 20 minutes, and that's the game. In the Super Nintendo version, it's basically the same thing, except Kevin actually feels like he's using the traps that he sets. If you recall in the NES version, you would drop traps on the ground, and Marv or Harry would just fall down, right? And they'd get right back up. The traps were barely represented anyway, they were just squares. The key objective, outside of not being gaped by Marv and Harry, is to collect treasures, and you drop them into a safe room, and once you get rid of all of the family's treasures, then you can fight a boss, and the game is over. It's very silly, but then again, it always was. At least this version looks better. And that's it. Did you happen to play any of these games when the system first released? If so, how did you feel about it? Feel free to tell us down below. I would personally love to hear it. I know the community would as well. We're a group of retro enthusiasts that really like remembering a time when life was a little bit easier to live, and if you made it to the end of this episode, you're already home, so feel free to subscribe. We'd love to have you here. Recently, we hit 5,000 subscribers, and I want to personally say thank you to everyone who's come aboard to make this dream a reality. You all mean the world to me. Finally, the single most important thing that you can do for me is to hit that thumbs up button, as it directly impacts the visibility of my projects and the videos that I work on every single day. As always, from my family to your family, good energy, good vibes, Fortefyre out.